Dark chosen ones, your deepest pain holds these spiritual gifts. There are some truths so deep, so ancient, and so terrifyingly beautiful that they don't whisper, they roar from the silence within your wounds. And yet, most people never hear them. Because we've been conditioned to run from pain, to silence it, to numb it, to medicate it, to avoid it at all costs. But what if I told you that the very pain you've been trying to escape is the doorway to your power? What if the suffering that has nearly broken you was not a punishment, but a sacred preparation? You see, you're not broken, you are breaking open, and that is the beginning of the path for the dark chosen ones. I know. That phrase, dark chosen ones, it stirs something in you. Maybe it makes you uncomfortable. Maybe it makes you curious. Or maybe it makes you feel seen. Because some of us were never meant to be bathed in the light of conventional spirituality. Some of us were forged in the shadows, tested by silence, and raised by storms. And we didn't come here to be saved. We came here to remember. You didn't choose this path consciously. The path chose you by marking your life with unbearable depth. Because only those who have touched the bottom of human despair can carry the kind of medicine that heals at the soul level.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound spiritual lesson.
Let me ask you something. Have you ever felt like your pain was too much for this world? Like you felt emotions deeper than anyone around you seemed to understand? Like you carried a sadness, a rage, or an ache that didn't even feel like it belonged to this lifetime? That's not a disorder. That's not weakness. That's not you being too sensitive. That's your initiation. That's your soul's signal that you are being prepared not for destruction, but for revelation. Your pain is the crucible, and inside that crucible, something ancient is awakening. We live in a world obsessed with comfort and convenience. But comfort doesn't awaken power. Pain does. Pain strips away the false identities you've been forced to wear. It burns away the stories you've been told about who you are and what you're worth. It isolates you not to punish you, but to get you alone with your truth. Because in the silence, in the heartbreak, in the nights where you didn't even want to be alive anymore, that's where the real voice started to whisper. That's where the real you began to emerge. You see, the dark chosen ones don't find their gifts in temples or retreats. They find them in the wreckage, in the betrayal that shattered their trust, in the abandonment that left them crying into the void, in the trauma that no one else believed. They find their gifts in the darkness because that's where they were hidden. And once you've been in that kind of darkness, once you've survived it, you become something else entirely. You don't just heal, you become the healing. You don't just find the light, you carry it into places no one else dares to go. The world teaches us to seek power through status, money, beauty, performance. But the true power of a dark chosen one doesn't come from anything external. It comes from what they've endured. It comes from what they've transcended. It comes from the fact that they felt like dying, but they chose to live. And not just live, but transform. That choice, that moment where you said, I won't give up, even when no one was watching, even when it didn't feel like it mattered, that was the moment your gift activated. And here's the secret that almost no one will tell you. The deeper the pain, the higher the potential. That's not spiritual fluff. That's spiritual physics. Because the soul expands in proportion to its contraction. Like a bowstring being pulled back before release. The greater the tension, the further the arrow flies. So if your life has been heavy, if your childhood was a battlefield, if your relationships have been war zones, if your mind has felt like a prison, you are being prepared for something massive. The universe doesn't waste agony. It refines it into power. But you have to be willing to stop running. You have to be willing to turn around and face the thing you've been avoiding. You have to stop trying to fix yourself and start listening to yourself. What if your pain isn't asking to be healed first? What if it's asking to be honored? What if those sleepless nights, that anxiety, that anger, that shame, what if they are sacred messengers? What if they are the guardians of your gift? Because here's what I've learned, and what all dark chosen ones eventually come to understand: your pain is encoded with purpose. Inside your suffering are frequencies that, when unlocked, give you abilities others can't even comprehend. I'm talking about intuitive sight so sharp you can read a room in seconds. I'm talking about emotional depth so vast you can hold space for people others would flee from. I'm talking about spiritual resilience that makes you unshakable in the face of chaos. But these are not gifts you can buy. They are earned through descent, through death, through rebirth. And there's something else. Your deepest pain connects you to the pain of the collective. It makes you an empath, not just of emotion, but of energy. You don't just feel people, you know them. You don't just sense what's wrong, you see it. And you can't unsee it. That's why so many chosen struggle to stay in the mundane world. That's why you might have felt like you're too much, or too intense, or too different. Because you are. You were never meant to fit in. You were meant to wake up. But awakening hurts. It shatters your illusions. It forces you to let go of the life you thought you wanted. And in that emptiness, that loneliness, that exile, you find your origin. You remember that you're not here to be normal. You're here to be real. And realness requires going into the depth of your being and reclaiming every piece of yourself that was lost to fear, shame, or silence. So I ask you now, not with judgment but with reverence, what if your pain is not your enemy, but your teacher? What if your scars are not symbols of failure, but of sacred survival? And what if everything you've been through was not a detour, but your exact path to becoming who you were always meant to be? The gifts beneath the grief, how darkness unlocks powers hidden in your soul. There's a moment in the journey of every dark chosen one where everything breaks. The job falls apart. The relationship crumbles. The identity you clung to like a lifeline gets stripped away, piece by piece. You fall to your knees, surrounded by the fragments of who you thought you were. And in that moment, the world goes silent. There's no one to save you, no one to give you the right words. That silence is brutal, but it's also sacred. Because what happens next is something most people never get to experience. In that silence, you begin to hear something else. A voice not from outside, but from deep within. A whisper that's older than your name. And it says, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." Grief is not just the emotional aftermath of loss. It is the sacred fire that burns away the illusions of control. Grief is the gatekeeper to transformation. It rips open the heart, not to destroy it, but to expand it. When you lose what you thought you couldn't live without, be it a person, a dream, a piece of your identity, you are given a rare invitation to find the part of you that was never dependent on those things to begin with. That's the first gift hidden beneath the grief: resilience birthed from surrender. Not the kind of resilience that wears a mask and pretends everything's fine, but the kind that rises from the ashes with eyes that have seen the truth and still choose to love. Many people think spiritual gifts are about seeing visions, hearing voices, channeling energy. And yes, those things are real. But they are not the beginning, they are the result. The true gifts come first as wounds. The grief you carry is the key that unlocks deeper perception, because grief strips away the noise. It makes you still. It makes you feel. And when you truly feel, you begin to awaken dormant senses. Suddenly, you start to notice the subtle energies around people. You walk into spaces and feel the weight of the room. You hear someone's words, but your body tells you what they're not saying. You begin to sense when your path is aligned or distorted, not through logic, but through knowing. That knowing is your soul speaking, and grief is what clears the channel. But the gifts don't stop at perception. There's another layer, deeper and more startling. When you've moved through real grief, when you've sat with your own ghosts and didn't run, you begin to touch something eternal. You begin to access a frequency of compassion so intense, it becomes a superpower. You stop judging people by their masks. You start seeing the child behind the anger, the wound behind the ego, the fear behind the cruelty. You develop what I call soul sight. And soul sight isn't just about spiritual insight. It's about being able to look into the eyes of someone who's suffering and hold a space so strong, so non-judgmental, so deeply present that healing starts to happen just by your being there. Can you imagine carrying that kind of presence? Not because you read it in a book, but because you earned it in the fire of your own pain. That's what grief gives you. That's what your darkness was always trying to awaken. You didn't go through all that just to be numb or bitter or broken. You went through it so you could become a bridge, a guide, a healer. Not because you're perfect, but because you remember. You remember what it's like to feel like you're drowning in your own sadness. You remember what it's like to scream and get no answer, and that memory becomes medicine. There's another gift buried in the darkness, one that few talk about because it's so raw, so misunderstood. It's the power of rage transmutation. When you've been hurt deeply, when you've been betrayed, abandoned, or violated, rage rises. And for most of us, we're told to suppress it, to fear it, to turn it inward. But for the dark chosen ones, rage is not a curse. It's a compass. That fiery energy, when transmuted through awareness and intention, becomes a force of fierce clarity. It becomes creative fire. It becomes the voice that says, no more self-betrayal, no more silencing, no more hiding. That sacred rage can fuel revolutions within. It can burn down old belief systems and create space for your authentic self to rise. So many of us carry pain that seems unbearable because we were never taught how to alchemize it. But here's the truth, your pain has always had a purpose, not to define you, but to refine you. Every tear you shed was watering the roots of your soul's power. Every moment you felt unseen was preparing you to see others more clearly. Every time you were silenced, you were being taught the value of truth. These are not metaphors. These are spiritual technologies, and they've been encoded into your very being since before you were born. You are not behind in your journey. You are not too late. You are not broken. You are becoming. And your grief is not a sign that you're failing, it's a sign that you are feeling. And feeling is the doorway to remembering. So the next time your heart aches, instead of asking, why is this happening to me? Ask, what power is this pain trying to awaken in me? Because it's there, beneath the grief, beneath the darkness, waiting for you to listen. Initiation through isolation. Why being alone unlocks your soul's hidden blueprint. There are moments in life when everything goes quiet, not just outside, but inside. The calls stop coming. The invitations vanish. The people you thought would be there forever begin to fade. Suddenly, you find yourself sitting in rooms that feel too big, scrolling through messages that never come, staring into the mirror, trying to make sense of who you're becoming. For most, this kind of silence feels like exile. But for the dark chosen ones, this silence is initiation, because it's in the absence of noise that the soul finally begins to speak. We live in a world that's terrified of being alone. We're constantly connected, endlessly stimulated, always reaching for someone or something to fill the gaps. But what happens when the universe takes it all away, not to punish you, but to prepare you? What happens when the very people you love the most begin to drift, not out of malice, but because your frequency is shifting? That's not abandonment. That's alignment. That's the moment the path begins to narrow and you realize that the next part of your journey can only be walked alone. Isolation is not loneliness, it is sacred space. It is the forge where the soul's true blueprint is revealed. When you're no longer absorbing the projections, expectations, and distractions of others, you begin to see yourself clearly for the first time. You start to notice patterns, why you react the way you do, why certain relationships keep repeating, why you've been afraid to fully step into your power. You begin to meet the parts of you that were buried under people-pleasing, perfectionism, or fear of rejection. And those parts, they're not weak. They are ancient fragments of your soul that have been waiting to return. But here's what no one tells you. This part of the journey hurts. It's messy. It's confusing. When you're in the thick of spiritual isolation, it feels like you're losing everything. And in a way, you are. You're losing the version of you that was built for survival, not for truth. You're losing the masks, the roles, the illusions. And that loss creates space for your real self to emerge. Not the self that fits into boxes, but the self that remembers. The self that knows your mission is bigger than comfort. The self that doesn't need to be understood to be real. In solitude, the soul begins to activate dormant codes, gifts that couldn't awaken in the chaos of the crowd. This is where your intuitive senses start to sharpen. You begin to feel things before they happen. You start getting downloads in dreams, flashes of insight that seem to come from nowhere. You begin to remember things you never studied, speak truths you never read. That's not your imagination. That's your soul blueprint coming online. And here's the wild part. The more time you spend in this sacred solitude, the more you realize you're not alone at all. You're finally in communion with your higher self, your guides, your ancestors. The silence becomes symphony. But to fully receive these gifts, you have to stop resisting the aloneness. You have to stop seeing it as something to escape and start seeing it as something to explore. What if this season of isolation isn't a detour, but the exact terrain your soul needs to cross in order to unlock its next level? What if the reason everything fell away is because your spirit outgrew the container it was living in, and now it's time to build something new, something sacred, something new? This is the space where you start to shift from seeking to embodying. You stop looking for answers outside of you and start trusting what's already within. You begin to make decisions not based on fear, but on resonance. You start to say no to things that don't align, even if they're familiar. You start to say yes to things that scare you because they expand you. And with every choice, you draw closer to the version of yourself that isn't just surviving but awakening. Isolation also teaches you the art of energetic sovereignty. When you're alone, you start to feel your own energy clearly. You notice how certain thoughts drain you, how certain environments disturb your peace, how certain habits numb your power. And from that awareness, you begin to reclaim your field. You learn to protect your energy not by building walls, but by anchoring deeper into your truth. You start to realize that boundaries aren't about keeping people out. They're about keeping your essence intact. This phase of the journey isn't glamorous. There are no awards for healing in silence, no applause for choosing growth over fitting in. But this is where the real transformation happens. This is where you shed lifetimes of conditioning. This is where you stop being a reflection of your trauma and start becoming a reflection of your soul. And once you've walked through this part, once you've sat in the dark long enough to see your own light, you carry a power that no one can take from you. You become someone who doesn't need a crowd to feel worthy, who doesn't need validation to feel strong. You become someone who has met themselves in the void and come back with gold. So I ask you now, what would happen if you stopped fighting your solitude and started listening to it? What would happen if you treated this moment not as a curse, but as a calling? Because your soul knows. Your soul has always known. And it's speaking louder now, not because you're lost, but because you're finally quiet enough to hear. The final emergence, how your pain becomes power, that awakens the world. There comes a moment quiet, almost unnoticeable, when something inside you shifts. You don't announce it. There's no dramatic lightning bolt from the sky. But suddenly, you're no longer trying to escape your past. You're no longer fighting your pain, hiding your grief, or apologizing for your depth. You've stopped seeking permission to be who you are. You realize that everything you've endured, everything that scarred you, silenced you, shattered you, it was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to forge you. And now, after the fire, after the solitude, after the endless unraveling, you emerge. Not as a victim, not even as a survivor, but as a force. This is the point where the dark chosen ones begin to embody their true purpose, not in theory, but in vibration. You've walked through the underworld of your own soul, and now you carry the codes that others need to remember who they are. You don't need to preach. Your presence becomes the transmission. People start to feel something shift when they're around you. They come to you not even knowing why, only that they feel safe, seen, and stirred in a way they haven't in years. That's not ego. That's your soul finally radiating from a place of truth. Because when you stop hiding your pain, you start sharing your medicine. You are a living example of what it means to transmute darkness into light. And not the artificial kind of light that pretends everything is okay, but the raw, holy light that has stared into the abyss and made peace with it. You carry the wisdom of the wound. You know what it means to lose everything and still rise. You've become the kind of person who can hold someone else's suffering without flinching because you've already met your own. That's a rare power. And it's exactly what this world is starving for. But here's the deeper truth most never realize: your pain was never just about you. It was the training ground for your mission. The trauma you endured, the heartbreak you survived, the loneliness that once consumed you, it all taught you how to feel the world's pain. It taught you how to listen beyond words, how to sense what others ignore, how to guide without controlling. You've become a vessel, not because you sought power, but because you surrendered to truth. And in doing so, you became a mirror for awakening. There is a reason you were born into this time, into this body, into these exact experiences. Your soul knew what it came here to do. It knew the codes you would carry. It knew the darkness you'd have to pass through to activate them. And now, those codes are alive in you. They're not just spiritual gifts, they're survival gifts. They're the blueprint for healing a world that's forgotten how to feel. You are not here to save the world through force. You are here to remind it through embodiment. That's why the final part of this journey is not about escape, it's about return. You return to the world, not as the person who left it, but as someone reborn. You return with clarity, with compassion, with boundaries that are rooted in self-respect, not fear. You no longer need to explain your depth. You simply live it. And in doing so, you give others permission to do the same. This is how your pain becomes power, not through domination, but through resonance. You become the calm in the chaos, the truth in the noise, the lighthouse for those still lost in the storm. So I'll ask you now, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. What will you do with the power your pain has given you? Will you keep it locked away, hidden beneath old stories? Or will you let it rise, let it breathe, let it lead? Because the world doesn't need more perfection. It needs more people who've walked through their fire and come out carrying light. It needs you, not the masked version, not the edited version, but the real, raw, radiant you. You've made it through the darkness not to escape it, but to become the guide for others who are still finding their way. That is your medicine. That is your gift. That is your legacy. And now it's time to rise, not as someone waiting to be chosen, but as someone who has already remembered you were never lost. You were being initiated. And now it's your turn to awaken the world.